In June of 2004, the DEA's mobile enforcement team concluded a 9-month investigation in America's oldest seaport with a large coordinated bust assisted by the Essex County Sheriff's Department and the Cape Ann Regional Task Force. The conspiracy was surprisingly being led by an enterprising business major at UMASS Lowell. This young ringleader was allegedly being supplied by a member of a notorious outlaw motorcycle club on Boston's North Shore. Here's the story of one of the most memorable cases of an iconic era. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. So this month marks the 20th anniversary of one of the biggest busts in the North Shore of Boston and most certainly this particular city's history. It's in fact the 20th anniversary of this St. Peter's Fiesta, which happens the last weekend of every June. This is an important story for me to tell because of how it personally affected me and a large part of my generation. A lot has changed in the past 20 years since the bust has happened. Many people have passed on and the city itself is almost completely different. Like many other stories that I cover on my channel, the sole purpose of making this video is just so people don't forget things that happened in the past, especially events that affected people in such a meaningful way. So many young people, including myself, had their lives ruined because of this particular product. Not only that, but the attitude back then was so different. They treated most of us like criminals instead of people that needed help. Now the mindset has changed, but we can't forget what transpired and just sweep it up under the rug. I'd like to send out a special thanks to a couple guys I reached out to that were involved in this case, and they helped me out with details I wasn't 100% sure on or weren't in the official report. The basic backdrop of this story is that an enterprising student at UMass Lowell who was already dabbling in illegal activities saw a moment in time and capitalized on it. In the early 2000s, a new and powerful miracle product came onto the scene and quickly a huge black market emerged. Due to YouTube's ad guidelines, I have to be careful with the words I say, so I apologize if you're confused at all. But this student at UMass Lowell had friends back at home in Gloucester who were starting to get involved with this new product, which was basically just a super version of an already existing formula. When he saw how much people liked it and the huge demand for it, he decided to find a connection to get him in the game. From late 2002 to 2004, this kid and other mid-level suppliers flooded Gloucester and other North Shore communities with this dangerous product. Gloucester has long had a subculture and a history of this type of activity. Well before this bust, there was a problem nationwide. Gloucester, which is America's oldest seaport and once one of the nation's biggest fishing ports, has long had a reputation as being a smuggling hub for organized crime factions. There's a large Sicilian population in the city of Gloucester, and that's where the St. Peter's Fiesta traditions come from. Most of the people from Gloucester who have Sicilian heritage come from the same village in Terracini, Sicily. But I've always heard growing up that the Italian LCN had stakes in the Gloucester waterfront and smuggled in stuff through the fishing boats. I always heard that as a kid that Peter Lamone even owned a bar in Gloucester and had interests in the city. I also heard that the old school legendary Lebanese bookies of Gloucester used to kick up to the north end as well. But of course there's always a little bit of fact mixed in with fiction in most of these urban tales. But whether it was coming in off the boats or from somewhere else, since the late 1960s there's been a deeply entrenched subculture in the city of Gloucester, Mass. Gentrification has completely changed the face of Gloucester like many Bay State communities, but because of Gloucester's natural beauty, it's been hit especially hard. People with money want to be here in the summertime, and that's basically the long and short of it. Since the turn of the millennium, the fishing industry is basically like a fraction of what it used to be, and when I mean a fraction, I mean a very, very small fraction, and the city depends solely on tourism to survive now. All the gritty dive bars that used to line Main Street and Roger Street on the waterfront are all posh restaurants and boutique stores now. As soon as they tore down the old Bird's Eye cold storage building in the Fort neighborhood and built that multi-million-dollar hotel, I knew the city was done. Well, at least the city that I grew up recognizing. Whenever I mention Gloucester in my videos, people always crack jokes, but it was a much different city back then. The whole area north of Middle Street was rough, especially around School and Columbia Street over to Gould Court and Mansfield Street. Another neighborhood that had a rough reputation was Shepherd and Willow Street and the whole Maplewood Park area. And then there was Friend Street and Taylor Street over on Portuguese Hill. And of course, there was Riverdale Park, which is a central part of this story.
Now, I'd be really remiss if I left these two guys out. Two really big local street legends, guys who were users way back in the day. Everybody in the city of Gloucester knew them, heard of them, grew up. Their parents warned them if you did stuff, you would end up like these two guys, Minky and the Wolfman. I actually was like a young kid, like 17, going to court, and the Wolfman, Tom Cavanaugh, he's passed away now, but he was in court for doing something like crazy. Like he stole some lady's purse and he was trying to like dig a hole in Burnham's field and bury it, and the cops caught him. But that was my introduction to the Wolfman in real life. But those are two legends from the streets back in Gloucester, like back in the day, the Wolfman and Minky. So I had to mention them.
Riverdale Park, or RDPK as it was tagged all over the city in the 1990s, is the larger of the two main public housing developments in Gloucester, Mass. Riverdale Park, especially when I was a kid in the 1990s, had a bad reputation, and this is where the DEA's task force first made contact with a member of the so-called ring and began to infiltrate the operation. But that comes later in the story. For now, I just wanted to give a little background on the city of Gloucester and explain that all this stuff existed here long before it was a national problem. The thing that changed during this particular case and the era connected to it was that it affected everyone from all walks of life. Before this, many of the younger people that got involved in that lifestyle grew up in an active household or an environment where they saw that type of behavior on a regular basis. But when these things burst onto the scene, it affected everyone from the kids in the park to the kids who grew up in solid two-parent middle-class/working class families, and even the kids from the rich neighborhoods like Easton Point and Annisquam. It really was like that crazy and dramatic of a thing. Like I remember going away in the fall of 2002, like in September or early October, and I got out in end of February, like the end of the winter, and I went to this huge house party in Gloucester, and there was like a couple hundred kids, all like late teens, early like college age, you know. I think I was like 19. I think I turned 20. I had my 20th birthday at the farm. That was a great 20th birthday, by the way. So I was walking around talking to like, kids I hadn't seen in a while, checking out girls and stuff, and I noticed like everybody's eyes are pinned, like the pupils are wicked small, and it's pretty naive, but I knew what that meant. And then like I opened up a door and there's a bunch of people in there doing the thing, and they just were like, you got $10, you can get down on this. I was like, all right, and it was just kind of like that, and it just like for like a solid year after that, from that was like end of February 2003 until the bust happened in 2004, it was just everywhere. Anytime you go to a house party in Gloucester, it was just that's just what it was like, and like everybody in the city was kind of dibbling dabbling, and that was the thing that was like so different about this. Those kids that were like squares in high school that didn't do anything, that didn't go to like parties in the woods, didn't do anything, and then I see them like a couple years out of high school and they're like deep into this stuff. So it was just like a really big like culture change, and it changed like the scene around here for sure, definitely. It really was that crazy of a change. It seemed like as if overnight everyone was taking them or dabbling with them, and they were just everywhere. I know this affected plenty of older people too, but the amount of teenagers and young adults that got hooked was like nothing ever seen in Gloucester or any of the other North Shore communities for that matter. Local police stations in Cape Ann were getting calls from concerned parents afraid of what their kids were getting involved in. This, along with the fact that police were finding more and more people in possession of this product in random stops, and also younger people were starting to be noticeably under the influence throughout the city, quickly caught local detectives' attention. When local Gloucester detectives started to really investigate what was happening, they were shocked by the quantity that these relatively young guys were moving in the city. When they began to realize that they didn't have the resources to take this investigation where it needed to go, they reached out to the DEA for help. But how is this really possible? I remember before I went to jail in the fall of 2002, I get random stuff from Baldy, and that's the nickname of the leader of the Gloucester Ring, but it was always different stuff, not a constant flow of the same product. Then when I came out in the spring of 2003, the city was flooded. Well, clearly in between he made connections that took him to a different level. As far as the court documents allege, and people I've spoken to said, Baldy's main supplier was a man named Carlos from Peabody, who was a member of a notorious North Shore 1%er biker club, which happened to be a support club of one of the most legendary outlaw and motorcycle clubs in history, the HAMC. Now, from what everyone I've talked to said, Los was doing this on his own with a childhood friend, another Portuguese kid from Peabody, who was not part of the club. The media always likes to make these things sound like they're a much bigger conspiracy than they actually are, but from all accounts, this endeavor was completely separate from the club. There are varying accounts of how Baldy in fact made the connection with Los. Somebody who I thought made the introduction for him told me that he didn't, and I believe him. I don't know why the guy would lie to me. Either way, 1% clubs have had a presence in Gloucester for a while. Back when I was younger, I remember seeing guys riding around town with aces and eights cuts on, and I thought they looked kind of cool. Apparently, they didn't have a clubhouse, and they used to hold church in the back room at Cameron's every week. On a side note, my father also had the reception for his third marriage in the back room at Cameron's. They just tore that building down a few years ago, another victim of gentrification. Now there's some condos and a boba tea shop there, just what we need in Gloucester. I wondered what happened to the Aces and Eights, but apparently around 2001, in an effort to regain total control of the north of Boston area, the Red Devils MC, the main HAMC support club in the area, began to patch over a lot of smaller local clubs. Like the Aces and Eights became the Red Devils Cape Ann. Armageddon out of Peabody became the Red Devils North Shore. And I believe it was the Headsman out of the Bill Rickett area became the Middlesex chapter of the Red Devils. One way or another, through someone in Gloucester or beyond, Baldy was introduced to Carlos, who happened to be a member of the MC, and the rest is basically history. The city and surrounding areas became flooded. You could call a number of people at any time of the day or night, and they were always on. Because of the surplus, the price was low as well. Quickly, people developed an incredible dependency on this stuff. It was crazy. Literally, if you called one person and they told you 20 minutes and you didn't want to wait, you call the next person and they would be like, I'd be right there. The other person would lose the sale. That's how readily available they were. Local detectives in Gloucester were salivating to get to the bottom of this giant influx of product in their city. A local detective who had connections with the DEA and was friends with a former detective who was now working with the ATF reached out to his friends in the feds and asked them for their assistance. The DEA's MAT, which stands for Mobile Enforcement Team, which works in combination with local law enforcement agencies, came to Gloucester to do a field assessment and quickly agreed that further investigation was necessary. The DEA's mobile enforcement team, which consisted of DEA agents, Essex County Sheriffs, and members of the Cape Ann Regional Task Force, decided that the best place to base their investigation out of was none other than Riverdale Park. Because of the high traffic and illegal activity that dominated the housing development in the 1990s and early 2000s, RDPK seemed like a natural place to base the operation out of. They planted 2 Latino men in a vacant in the park, and I know for a fact that one of the guys is a Dominican dude from Lawrence, and he works for the Essex County Sheriff's Department. Because when I got the bracelet in 2012, he drove me from the Lawrence farm to my ex's apartment in Gloucester, and he was like, yo, I haven't been out here since that big bust back in the day. And I started talking to him and told him that I knew a lot of the guys involved, and it was just kind of crazy to hear from his perspective. But they planted him, and I believe the other guy was an actual DEA agent in one of the units next door to one of the lower level players' baby mama's sister's unit. They made the initial contact with the alleged ring through this guy who was actively using himself, and they took advantage of his impaired state. Now, hindsight's 2020, and in retrospect, it seems really weird that 2 guys would be living in the projects alone with no women or children. The park is full of mostly single moms with kids. Sometimes the fathers are there, but mostly they're not. So it was basically unheard of in this time for 2 grown males with no children to be living in public housing, especially in Gloucester. I don't know what it's like in other cities. But this poor guy they made the contact with blamed himself for years because of his lapse in judgment, like he brought this upon everyone, which is simply not true. The investigation had already begun, and the feds were just looking for a weak link to infiltrate. Unfortunately for this guy, who I have to say has since changed his life around, is actually a really good, genuine, humble dude, but when he was actively using, he was a mess, he admits it himself. He told me he was so messed up, he probably would have sold it to them if they were in uniform, wearing the badge in plain sight. I honestly feel bad for him. He's carried the weight of this for so long, and in my opinion, the authorities just took advantage of him. But how did the feds zero in on their target and get this actual investigation started? They got on to my man in the park and set up shop there after they'd already gathered information and decided who was part of the ring. But where did that information come from initially? A legend that's always been told in the city, and a lot of guys involved truly believe this, that the guy who's now making movies about this stuff was working for the feds and put them on to Baldy and his crew. John Hickey is a very polarizing figure in these parts, and in Gloucester he's not very well liked. One of the reasons is the one I just mentioned. A lot of people truly believe that he was a federal informant, almost like some kind of secret agent. Now let me be clear, I have no evidence of this. I have never seen any concrete evidence of this, but still, people strongly believe this, and you cannot tell them it's not true. But also people from Gloucester resent the fact that he claims to be solely from Charlestown, even though he spent a large portion of his life in Gloucester. His mother was even a teacher at Gloucester High. His movie Oxymorons, which honestly I can't believe there's some people out there that really love that movie. But anyways, it's only about Charlestown, even though Hickey spent a lot of his adolescence in Gloucester and dealt with a lot of guys from the North Shore area. There's even people from Gloucester that he was friends with in the actual movie. But it just rubs a lot of people wrong in Gloucester that now in his movies he pretends like he never lived there. I personally have no problem with Hickey. He was nice to me the first time I was in Middleton when I was 18 in 2001 before all this happened. He worked in the barber shop and would call me up for special haircuts. I'm just relaying what the majority of the guys involved in this case believe, and just in the city of Gloucester in general. Around that time period, Hickey escaped while in custody, and he was on the lam for a few months before the marshals got him. But miraculously, he was back out on the street a very short time after. I guess a lot of people were avoiding him during this time period because they thought that was a little funny, but eventually he got a couple of his old buddies from when he lived above Steve's restaurant in Gloucester to deal with him and get him something. This is the story that a lot of the guys believe happened, and you really can't convince them otherwise. Now again, I can't say either way. I have no definitive proof. I don't have access to any classified documents about how the origins of the investigation started. All I know is that Hickey has gotten a bit of notoriety in the media and just released a new movie, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I just personally don't like his movies. I feel like they could be much more realistic and less comic booky, but that's my only personal opinion on this topic. Whether it was in fact John Hickey or someone else, by the second half of 2003, the mobile enforcement team of the DEA had zeroed in on their target and had made contact with a member of the ring. The tipping point in the investigation was the infamous meeting at the old Bugaboo Creek Steakhouse at the North Shore Mall in Peabody, which doesn't exist anymore. In this meeting, the feds realized the quantity that these guys were dealing with and also the connection to the outlaw motorcycle club. It was at this meeting that Baldy alleged he could provide 100-unit quantities at a time instead of just 10 packs. Local authorities didn't have that kind of capital on hand to make controlled buys of that size, so a Gloucester detective asked his friends in the DEA for help. Normally, the DEA wouldn't waste its resources on a group of teens and young adults, most of them who are actively using themselves, but with the quantity on the table plus the connection to the 1%er biker club, the feds committed 100% to the investigation. That's a main point I want to make in this video. Almost everyone involved except the guys at the top were all actively using and were solely a part of this to feed their personal vices. I feel like nowadays the mindset has shifted, and guys like the kid they made contact with in the park, amongst others, would have gotten help instead of years in a penitentiary. But that's not even the beginning of the hypocrisy in this case. It didn't take long after the DEA touched down in October of 2003 for them to sew up their investigation. With most of the guys involved being younger and inexperienced, their judgment was clouded due to their personal use, so they didn't make it that hard for the authorities to put together the case. They leaned on local users that got information they needed. A lot of these kids were in their teens and early 20s. They never had dealings with the law before, and then all of a sudden the DEA shows up at their door. It's intimidating. I'm not making excuses for anyone. Everyone makes their own choices in life, guys. But by June of 2004, only 9 months later, the task force was all ready to pounce on the ring and forever change the scene in the city of Gloucester. The dude from the park already had an open case, and a legendary lawyer from Gloucester, who has now passed on, told him to be careful that the feds are in town. The warning came too late, though, because they had already collected whatever evidence they needed to prosecute and convict. Prosecute and convict certain people, that is. There were certain people in this case that had been caught red-handed and had plenty of physical evidence against them, and there were others that would never been convicted unless someone cooperated. This lawyer who gave the heads up had allegedly done this before for old bank robbers from Gloucester, and he even had been disbarred for a time, but he was a good guy and definitely a legend in the city. Rest in peace. Very soon after he tipped off his client, the DEA and other task force members started taking people into custody. I remember this time vividly. I was moving lots of trees for my buddy who was going to college way up in northern Vermont, and I was trading with one of the guys involved in the case. I remember I got the phone call, the feds are in town, they're raiding everyone. I remember panicking and trying to bury a hockey bag with a couple elbows in it behind my dad's shed, and when he came home I was in the process and he was not happy about it. Luckily I never got subpoenaed to testify in front of a grand jury like a lot of people in town did. Like in a lot of these cases, which I don't agree with what the feds do, they use one of the guys at the top of the pyramid to turn on lower level players. The feds were mostly interested in identifying the source and connecting the MC to the conspiracy. The Red Devils member from Peabody felt confident in his position. He knew the authorities had no physical evidence on him. It was all on the guys from Gloucester. He did this with his buddy from Peabody in an endeavor separate from the club so the feds couldn't try to link them together in a big RICO case that they love to do against these outlaw motorcycle clubs. He felt so confident that he shoved the feds' original plea deal of 5 years thinking he could easily beat it at trial. What he didn't know was that the feds did have evidence, not of Los actually touching product, but sworn testimony from the alleged Gloucester ringleader Baldy that his main supplier of this vast pipeline supplying the North Shore was coming from Los. Apparently that's all they needed at trial to convict. The guy that the task force first made contact with in Riverdale Park was the first one also in turn to find out that Baldy flipped. They both had open cases when they were arrested in June of 2004, so unlike the others, they couldn't bail out. They were being held together in a federal holding in Rhode Island. A week or two before Christmas, Baldy came to the dude's cell and was randomly like, "Yo, I'm going home." The other dude was so confused, like, how is that possible? Before he could ask him what was up, Baldy left there in the next lock-in. To add insult to injury, when Baldy left the block, he left all his stuff to his cellie he had just met and nothing to his supposed friend from back home, who, by the way, was struggling. He had no support on the outside and had two little kids, and it was just like rubbing salt in the wound. He knew there was only one reason Baldy would be leaving the holding before trial, and that's because he had flipped and become state's evidence. I guess I can see where the feds justified making a deal with Baldy to get to the source of the product and hopefully tie in the motorcycle club, but I don't understand why they needed him to testify against people that were below him in the supposed ring, which was really nothing more than a loose group of friends, different sub-cliques and a bigger clique that were all dabbling in the same thing and got caught up in the same cycle of active use. Like, was it really necessary for the government to prosecute some of these guys so aggressively? One guy was part of the case solely for being present at the Bugaboo Creek meeting. He was a substitute teacher and a baseball coach, and this ruined his life. He lost everything before losing his actual life to the disease. I just feel like they would pursue this case in a different way 20 years later, with absolutely no violence connected to it whatsoever, and the vast majority of being active users themselves. I don't think they'd prosecute the same way today. I'm glad that lawmakers have changed their attitudes and their policies, but you still can't forget what transpired before we got to this place, where there's at least some form of recognition this isn't just a criminal justice issue. I personally lived through first-hand experience, survived the entire 80s period, and I guarantee you it's not a dramatization about how much it affected my generation. The mark this period left on the city and the surrounding areas are kind of hard to wrap your head around if you didn't experience it personally. Once the supply of this certain product dried up in the city, people had to drive long distances out of town on a daily basis and pay higher prices. It didn't make any sense. All the while, enterprising Dominican traffickers were flooding the streets of the Northeast with a tried and true product, just in a new marketing form. Countless people made the switch, I myself did, and that's when things really began to change. People started disappearing slowly at first, and then by the 20-teens, it was at a ridiculous pace. The sad but true facts are it's as bad now as it ever has been, and the stuff that's out there just keeps getting more and more dangerous. It almost makes what we were doing back then look like child's play. That era had a bit of innocence to it, when you still trusted people. You still hung out with your friends and knew someone would always get you off E. Over the years, the game has changed, and there's no level of trust or code anymore. The old school street user mentality not to let another person go sick is gone. Everyone is out for themselves. It just keeps getting uglier and uglier out there. Just go to an active area and see for yourself. It's half nightmare, half tragedy. The scene in Gloucester was never the same again since 2004. When Baldy took the stand against his close friends, one especially close friend, he broke a bond a lot of these guys really trusted and believed in. After this, people either got clean and moved on with their life, and I know plenty of people in the city that never did anything before this, got caught up in it and either got on subs or whatever they had to do, got clean and have stayed that way, started families and lived normal lives. But unfortunately, more often than not, the sad fact is that most of the kids that got caught up in this wave never made it out and lost their battle with the disease. I personally have lost two of my best childhood friends early on in this thing in 2011 and 2013. But just a couple of years ago, one of the only people I've gotten really close to in the past 10 years went out after multiple years of clean time and only 2 days later was gone. It broke my heart. I still don't like thinking about any of it. They used to have a vigil on the boulevard right near where I live in Gloucester for the people who have passed through this epidemic. I'm not sure if they still do it. I went one year and wrote my friends' names down in the bag and I lit the glow stick and I put it in the bag. I did this because people told me it would help. But nothing that I can find besides faith in a higher power helps with that type of pain. So in conclusion to the case, most of the lower level guys got a few years. Baldy took the stand against multiple people at trial, even one of his closest childhood friends. I was in an inpatient place with a guy who was a juror at that trial, and when he found out I was from Gloucester, he told me about being on the jury. He said all the jurors hated Baldy, they thought he was a really bad guy. The people that got hit the worst were Carlos and his buddy from Peabody. Los took it to trial and got smoked, sentenced to 20 years all on Baldy's testimony. His friend who came to America as a small child was deported back to the Azores, even though he had never lived there. He never actually became a U.S. citizen, so he got the boot. Even with his cooperation and testimony, Baldy still had to do some time. Nobody won in this case, in my opinion. Everyone lost. Most of the guys have moved on with their lives. Baldy still lives in town, and no one really cares at this point. I think most of the guys accept the part that they personally played in all of this. But with that being said, no one is ever going to forget that this happened. 20 years later, it's just like one of the guys in the case said to me, Jay, it was like a lifetime ago. Real quick before I end this video, I just want to shout out somebody that helped me out. He let me use some of the images from his rap video that he filmed a couple months ago here in Gloucester. His older brother is a member of this case. If you want to go support his music, it's Ant Ignorant, A-N-T Ignorant. You can find him on YouTube, follow him on Instagram as well. Like I said, his older brother was a member of this case, and he's got a good story himself. But he let me use some images that I made into like collages from his rap video. So go check that out on YouTube. I want to shout out my buddy too, if he's watching, Johnny Chadwick. Just proud of him. He's doing really good. He's been digging clams and stuff. And I'm just, he just got off probation. He did time in Shirley Medium and stuff. And I'm just real proud of him. I just want to give him a quick shout out. Just everybody else who's doing good, who has struggled in the past with the problems that we've talked about in this video. Just best wishes to everybody.
So I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This is probably one of the biggest cautionary tales I've ever told on any of my videos. And this is like the exact reason why I say make good choices, make good decisions at the end of my videos, because look at the choices and decisions these guys made. It totally changed the trajectory of their lives, mine included. And just anybody out there, if you're struggling, and if you're in the North Shore, Cape Ann area, there's a place called Core, C-O-R-E. It's at the Fish Pier on Parker Street in Gloucester, and they're there with all types of different services to help somebody. So if you're struggling, reach out. Don't ever go back. If you're out of active use, don't ever go back. There's nothing bad enough that's happening in your life to make you want to go back to that chaos and destruction. So like I always say, guys, make good choices. Make good decisions. Thank you to the guys that I reached out to that helped me with this story. I couldn't have done it without you guys. But just try to take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends. I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.